in the middle of 242, he says, to all of this, to all of his hatred of the plantocracy, his hatred of slavery as an institution, his support for abolition, right, which was actually a very, very clear support, he says, to all this, there's one great qualification. Andrew Johnson could not include Negroes in any conceivable democracy. So he supported abolition. And why did he support it? He supported abolition because it meant breaking the backs of the Southern aristocrats. He supported abolition and he joined Lincoln on the ticket because his goal was, as a poor white, to break the power of those landed elites. In a certain sense, you see from the very beginning that, Black people and enslaved people for Andrew Johnson are a kind of means to an end, right? They should be free because freeing them will destroy the power of my real enemies, the oligarchy, the plantocracy. Does that make sense? And as Du Bois puts it, he could seldom envisage poor Black people as part of the working class, as part of the laboring class. And this is a key part of the contradiction. Because ironically, and Du Bois calls it through a weird magic of history, this is on the top of page 251, through a weird magic of history, 252. Johnson suddenly, and again very accidentally, becomes, as he puts it, the real emancipator of 4 million of Black slaves, right? Lincoln was killed, and then suddenly he is the one overseeing their freedom, overseeing making that freedom real, and overseeing the process of Reconstruction. He does so at first by following what was Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, which we talked about a little bit. A kind of limited plan, a plan that the goal of which was unity, right? The goal was to reincorporate Southern states as quickly as possible. If you remember, there are two different and contradictory approaches which see the states that seceded as having committed suicide on the one hand, meaning they don't exist as states anymore. That's the radical Reconstruction vision. Or the more limited vision is grounded in an understanding which begins from the fact that there's still states that then can make a decision to rejoin, right? Through any kind of formula, right? 10% of the population denounces the Confederacy, 50% of the population denounces the Confederacy, and different formulas of how many sort of former Confederates can be participating, in the aftermath. So Johnson is pursuing a sort of more conservative and limited Reconstruction plan, which means let's get these states reincorporated as quickly as possible. Let's embrace and actually reward the loyal elements of that state, right? They're able to, pronounce their loyalty, affirm it, and we should reward that by bringing them back in. Lincoln would even say, if we don't allow them to re-enter, what we're saying to the loyal elements of Georgia, Alabama, and other states is that, is that we're not going to support and recognize their ability to lead that state moving forward, if that makes sense. So Johnson is moving forward with the Lincoln Plan, and he's doing so by bypassing Congress entirely, which is going to be, the core of the constitutional crisis. But what is the core of who, Andrew Johnson was, and the contradictory elements of his personality, right? What is that contradictory core and paradoxical core that Du Bois identifies that leads to him turning, as Du Bois put it, away from the future and toward the past, right? What leads to his turnaround away from Reconstruction and toward the plantocracy? Here's someone who hates the planters, again, who hates that aristocracy, and yet in a matter of months assumes a far more conservative turn that Du Bois would understand is turning backwards. If we look on page 254 toward the bottom, as Du Bois puts it, no wonder the attitude of Johnson toward the South and the leaders of the rebellion was transformed. The very inferiority complex which made him hate the white planter concealed a secret admiration. His hatred of the planter concealed a secret admiration for their position, for their status. And if you look over on page 255, Du Bois speaks of the way that Johnson, who he calls the plebeian, who before the war had been treated with undisguised contempt by the slave-holding aristocracy, could not withstand the subtle flattery of the same aristocracy when they flocked around him. So what's happening? He comes to power. He immediately begins to see himself as the unifier of the nation, the one tasked with this contradictory work. But at the same time, these planters are suddenly seeing him as their vehicle back into power, right? So they flock around him, they flatter him, they tell him all the things that he wants to hear. And what does that sound like to a poor white, right? It sounds like you're finally admitted into the club of rich whites. You're finally admitted into the contradictory planter club, the thing that poor white consciousness is kind of built around, right? The dynamic core at the heart of Johnson's personality was in many ways a microcosm of the wages of whiteness and the effectiveness of those wages. The way that the psychological disdain for the rich whites, the contempt for the rich, and again, think about Trump when you hear this, the contempt for the rich, the contempt for elites, the way that that can be easily channeled back into an alliance of white solidarity. Johnson had even expressed his support for Black suffrage at one point. Again, very instrumentally, right? Black suffrage as a means to break the back of the planter class, which is the same way that capitalists had seen Black suffrage. But then he becomes skeptical very quickly, and then he ultimately opposes it. And as we'll see, by the end, he's speaking in overtly white supremacist terms, right? Lincoln's vice president, right? So this is a very radical about face. And to accomplish this, he reformulates in a fundamental way how he sees the relationship between race and class. Again, at the beginning, the primary adversary was the rich planter class, those who owned the land, those who monopolized it, those who dominated labor of all types. You know, in this vision from the very beginning for Johnson, there was a ignorance or neglect of the fact that Black people constituted part of the laboring class. But even this constitutes an inversion. He radically transforms it. He begins by reconfiguring race around questions of class. He begins to make arguments, as Du Bois identifies, about the ways in which white and Black workers innately, naturally hate each other, right? How they're naturally opposed to each other. And as a result, he's beginning to shift blame away from the planters, right? Less emphasis on the actual adversary and more emphasis on the contradiction. In February of 1866, this is over on page 298, Frederick Douglass even visits him in the White House. He sees this transformation happening. And of course, abolitionists are getting incredibly worried because they're seeing the rhetoric of this Reconstruction president begin to shift very quickly. This is all within 1860, the latter parts of 1865 into 1866. So now we're talking about less than a year since Lincoln's death. Douglass and other Black leaders go to the White House. They meet with Johnson. They try to push back on this. And Douglass identifies it very clearly. He says this whole idea that Black and white workers are innately opposed to each other is, as what he calls, incited on both sides by the cunning of the slave masters, right? That's exactly what the planters, the slave masters are trying to sort of provoke and trying to argue, right? That these two sets of workers have warring interests, that the white workers are on the side of the planters, and that that's the sort of multi-class solidarity that needs to be developed. And Douglass and others warn Johnson in this context that, as Douglass put it, you enfranchise your enemies and disenfranchise your friends, right? You're succumbing to the sort of the flattery of these rich planters, and you're forgetting about who saved your ass in the war, and you're forgetting about who, in Du Bois's vision, and even in Lincoln's vision before he died, who would be the most loyal element moving forward, right? Who could guarantee democracy and who should be embraced. Concretely, what's happening? This is, again, part of what leads this chapter to be so incredibly long, is the fact that he's trying to move through a lot of historical pieces. This leads to this tension and this rightward shift of Johnson. The questions around what Reconstruction actually means leads to a standoff and a constitutional crisis. It's a standoff between the executive and Congress. And Lincoln had been very powerful as an executive, but he was also willing to moderate and steer the course of least resistance in terms of making Reconstruction happen. Here was Johnson trying to slow Reconstruction, trying to weaken it, in a sense, trying to declare Reconstruction over before it had even started and readmit all of these southern states with Confederates in power, right? So we're talking about the um, ending of Reconstruction before it even begins and without any substantial um, changes even happening. There's a standoff between branches of government. In this context, black codes are expanding across the US South. There's a proposal to extend and expand the Freedmen's Bureau, again, as the mechanism of pushing forward Reconstruction in the South. Johnson vetoes this. There's as a result of that, in a lot of ways, a proposal to institute a Civil Rights Act. Johnson's vetoing all of these things. All of these are leading toward and pushing Congress to be more radical and to say, well, if you don't want a Civil Rights Act, then let's make this into a constitutional amendment. Let's have the 14th Amendment. And all of these debates are emerging around the 14th Amendment, which are very interesting because they repose the question that we talked about before of the three-fifths compromise. The debates have everything to do with apportionment. They have everything to do with how you count citizens in terms of giving, the number of representatives that each state gets in the Congress. And again, remember here that the fundamental question is who controls Congress, right? If the southern states fully, determine apportionment of representatives according to their entire population, they would be the dominant force in Congress. What does the entire population mean? It means counting all Black people as 100% of a person, right? We talked about the fact that the three-fifths compromise was actually a compromise in which the Southern planters wanted Black people to be represented 100%, because that gave them a sort of exaggerated power in Congress. In this context, Northern states are saying, no, we don't. If you're not giving people civil rights, if you're not willing to recognize these people as citizens, they should not be counted for apportionment. So this is where the way the debates are emerging around the 14th Amendment, which again, it roughly is about citizenship and how it's acquired and how it's gained. Right? Again, this is a question that comes up today around migration, but these are the debates that are leading to it, which is why a lot of people today are saying any attack on the 14th Amendment is also tacitly and clearly an attack on Black people as well, right? Even if it's not being posed as that. So you've got debates around the 14th Amendment. You've got the 1866 election in which Johnson loses support. Congress swings pretty heavily toward Reconstruction because of the kind of arguments that Johnson is making, because he's seen as clearly moving in the direction of the planter elites. And you've got these really incredible sort of tit for tat dynamics that play out, where Johnson is just taking incredibly intransigent positions. And we'll talk about them more when it comes to Reconstruction, but he's sort of trying to dismiss generals. He's trying to overrule everything Congress is doing, and Congress is simply assumes a position of overruling the veto with a 2/3 vote, right? Johnson will veto something, Congress will overrule the veto. They'll propose another bill, another Reconstruction measure, Johnson will veto it, and Congress will come together and override the veto. This is where the constitutional crisis emerges. If you turn over to 319, Du Bois paints and sketches the broad arc of where things are going to move, and it's worth reading because it's roughly the arc of Reconstruction. He does this, as I mentioned a few times in the book, but this is a particularly useful one at the very bottom of 319. For a brief period, what he calls 7 mystic years. 7 mystic years that stretched between Johnson's swing around the circle speech, that's in, I think, 1866, his re-election campaign, to the Panic of 1873, an economic crisis that is the early end of Reconstruction. The majority of thinking Americans in the North believed in the equal manhood of Negroes. They acted accordingly with a thoroughness and clean-cut decision that no age which does not share that faith can in the slightest comprehend. They did not free draft animals, nor enfranchise guerrillas, nor welcome morons to Congress. They simply recognized Black folks as men. Now on to the next paragraph. Then came, in 1873 to 76, sudden and complete disillusion, not at Negroes, but at the world, at business, at work, at religion, at art. A bitter protest of Southern property reinforced Northern reaction. And while after long years, the American world recovered in most matters, it is never yet quite understood why it could ever have thought that black men were altogether human. So again, that's the arc of Reconstruction, but it's being told according to a narrative of dehumanization, the pushing back of white supremacy, access to a certain level of the category of the human, 7 mystic years, the retreat of white supremacy, and then it all kind of collapses, right? That's on the sort of, again, the ontological level, the level of being, the level of humanity, the arc of what Reconstruction meant. And this all happened not thanks to Andrew Johnson, but despite him. Again, that kind of peculiar cunning of history. And actually not even despite him, right? It didn't exactly happen despite him. It happened against his will, but as the result of his own actions, right? His own intransigence, his own stubbornness, his own failures. And this is where we really get to the question of, and return to the question of transubstantiation and Du Bois' final diagnosis, denunciation. There's 100 pages, this chapter, of absolutely shitting on Andrew Johnson. And he reserved some of his most amazing prose for him. For example, on page 318, I love the way this paragraph starts. The most charitable thing that the defenders of Andrew Johnson can say about him is that occasionally he got drunk. That is the most charitable thing you can say about Andrew Johnson, is that occasionally he got drunk. For too much liquor alone would excuse such extraordinary conduct and performances. If he was not an occasional drunkard, he was God's own fool. That's wild. The Republicans took every advantage of the situation. I love here, he says, and this is a quote, "He cannot shake off the bootlicking proclivity born and bred in him toward the aristocracy of the South." The bootlicking proclivity, which again was a bootlicking proclivity of all poor whites, right? Not endemic, but a temptation that's always there to identify with what you oppose, but only because you want it for yourself. That's the structure of the wages of whiteness and the sort of, tie that binds the poor white to the rich white. And then finally, on the bottom of 322, he returns really directly to the question. The transubstantiation of Andrew Johnson was complete. Middle of 322. He had begun as the champion of the poor laborer, demanding that the land monopoly of the Southern oligarchy be broken up so as to give access to the soil south and west to the free laborer. He had demanded the punishment of those Southerners who by slavery and war had made such an economic program impossible. Suddenly thrust into the presidency, he had retreated from this attitude. He had not only given up extravagant ideas of punishment, but he dropped his demand for dividing up the plantations when he realized that Negroes would be largely its beneficiaries. Because he could not conceive of Negroes as men, he refused to advocate universal democracy, of which, in his young manhood, he had been the fiercest advocate. He was a radical Democrat. And he made a strong alliance with those who would restore slavery under another name. This change did not come by deliberate thought or conscious desire to hurt. It was rather the tragedy of American prejudice made flesh. This is the transubstantiation of Johnson, right? He is the tragedy of American prejudice made flesh. So that the man born to narrow circumstances, a rebel against economic privilege, died with the conventional ambition of a poor white to be the associate and benefactor of monopolists, planters, and slave drivers. In some respects, Andrew Johnson is the most pitiful figure of American history. A man who, despite great power and great ideas, became a puppet, played upon by mighty fingers and selfish, subtle minds, groping, self-made, unlettered and alone, drunk not so much with liquor as with the heady wine of sudden and accidental success. That's fucking wild. I love that. That is just like, he sat down and he tried to decide how he could destroy and obliterate the legacy of Andrew Johnson more than anyone else, because Andrew Johnson stood for all of that, right? Andrew Johnson stands for the poor white in the South, who stands for the actual vehicle and mechanism for the destruction of Reconstruction, right? That's what the transubstantiation means. We can stop here. We'll take some questions in the room. I think we've got some questions in the chat um, as well. But if anyone in the room has questions that you'd like to talk through about Andrew Johnson, about the embodiment of the wages of whiteness that he reflects, or about this early moment that leads us toward the radical Reconstruction phase, we would love to talk through it.
This isn't like, I mean, I don't know how to like articulate this as a question, but I'm curious about um like Andrew Johnson as a lesson to like, I don't know, our enemies in the current moment, where he like, because he refuses to like co-opt a movement, he like is defeated by it to a certain extent. I don't know. I feel like I'm just like interested in like that, and it speaks to how you're like speaking of him, how Du Bois is
As a
framing
lesson
him.
in the, as a lesson in how not to engage in co-optation, or how not to, again, like, use, the sort of judo energy of your enemies to project and move toward what it is that you're trying to. In other words, is a question of the rigidity, the intransigence. Exactly. One of the, of course, read over the next century, right, or century and a half, you see on the one hand the process of constant struggle toward Black freedom and toward economic equality, right? Not much progress on the economic equality piece, some minimal progress and victories on the Black freedom piece. But you do see, I think, in this case, your point, the question of these sort of like refining of strategies for defeating Black power and defeating the power of the poor in general, right? It's very different when we talk about, the strategy that, the arch Confederates use versus the strategy of co-opting, of the politics of representation, of the ways in which the past 50 or so years of the U.S. Have gone. And then the sort of stubbornness and the intransigence is another thing, because Du Bois really focuses in on the fact that Johnson really just miscalculated dramatically, right? Partly because he was drunk half the time, partly because he was being, again, drunk with flattery, right? He was being told all of these things by the Southern planters. He's listening to people he shouldn't have trusted, and they're not only giving him bad, like absolutely reprehensible, political guidance, but they're also giving him bad calculus when it comes to what his actual power base stands as, right? And more of this comes up in the next chapter, but again, like the most loyal sectors of the Union are, recently freed Black Americans, who, as Lincoln realized, would suddenly and in mass vote for supporting the Union, right? Whereas the most untrustworthy people who had helped to divide the Union and bring it, to the brink of destruction were the ones that Johnson's listening to, right? So there's a few things mixed in there. He definitely, though, as you put it quite well, is a figure of intransigence. And the flip side of that is that in a certain kind of way, on the next chapter piece, I'll talk about something which I mentioned before, which is this idea of the whip of the counter-revolution, right? Meaning the ways in which aggression from the right can strengthen our movements and set them into motion, right? And that's part of what happens here. You see this sort of back and forth between Congress and the executive, Johnson and Congress. And what Congress and the Republicans are learning in that whole process is they need to be more radical. They need to make more radical proposals, right? They cannot trust the Southern planters. They need to be fully disenfranchised and wiped off the face of the earth, right? Reconstruction has to be a dictatorship. That's not something, Lincoln didn't want that. He didn't think it was necessary. Johnson proves that it's necessary for Reconstruction to be a dictatorship and to be a brutal one, right? And so I think that's, exactly true. That's why ultimately, in the long run, the Confederates kind of win out. But in the short run, Johnson loses support. He's chased from power, and a much more radical form of Reconstruction is instituted. And as Du Bois puts it, this is the sort of like, he was speaking more generally of the South in a previous chapter. He said this was the just reward for their intransigence, was a far more radical process. Yeah. What else do we have for questions? We have a question in the chat.
Du Bois focuses a lot on Stevens and Sumner, but what role did social movements or non-state forces play in the increasing popularity of abolitionist ideals post-war?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something we've sort of gestured toward. So Stevens and Sumner are the representatives of Reconstruction in Congress, right? They were the representatives of abolition in Congress, then they become the representatives of radical Reconstruction in Congress. And one of the pieces that I think we often try to emphasize in general at abolition school is the fact that this is an incredible book, right? It's a foundation for so much of what we understand about US history and Reconstruction more narrowly and what Reconstruction should mean today. But it's a story that's told kind of consciously from the perspective of government, right? He's talking about congressional debates. He's talking later about what happens in state legislatures, because he's really trying to rewrite that story to, you know, defend Reconstruction on that level from all of the lies that were being told about it, right? So Du Bois takes upon himself this task of rewriting that story as what we could call maybe a history from above. It's not fully from above because we see the driving force of the story is the general strike of enslaved people that walk off the plantation, that set everything into motion, and that hold the power to transform the whole thing, right? But the way he tells the rest of the story is still very much what the resonances on the level of the state are of that, right? And there's two problems with this. I mean, there's multiple problems we could say. And again, they're not necessarily, this book is already almost 800 pages, right? It's not like he could have told the whole story in all of its sort of facets and contours. And he does hint toward this piece, but one question that more recent literature has really fleshed out is the question of what else is happening, right? That can look many different ways, right? Enslaved people who walked off the plantation, right, who gained and derived their power from the centrality of slavery to capitalism at that moment, they did not necessarily do so with an aspiration to remain within capitalism, right? It's not simply their strategic centrality within capitalism, it's also the social reproductive labor that they did to make their own communities, right? Or to build their socialist communes in different parts of the South. And Du Bois mentions some of these experiments. There's also the question of they didn't simply walk off the plantation to become soldiers in the Union Army, right? Or to defend or uphold the US government as an institution. That definitely happened for many, and they definitely saw, as you remember from the beginning, of how the general strike happens and the calculation of where my interest lay. They definitely decided that the Union troops were where their interest lay in that moment, but we don't want to act as if the entirety of that general strike in that movement was to be then contained within the US government in the state, if that makes sense. Why? Because, and we often talk about Emancipation Circus by Tulani Davis, a more recent book that just came out a few years ago. She shows the way in which all of these, formerly enslaved people who walked off in the general strike, established these massive encampments around the Union lines and around the Union encampments. And there they did lots of things. They talked about ideas and democracy. They developed new ways of thinking. They developed new communities, right? They're doing so much more than simply fighting the Union Army. So it's not so much, for me, Stevens and Sumner versus social movements, unless what we mean by social movements is very much this question of the driving force being enslaved people themselves and them being supplemented by and supported by abolitionist movements. Because one of the other things that Du Bois emphasized that's really crucial is that the abolitionist movements themselves were not super ideologically clear, definitely not about capitalism. And they were in some ways slightly capitalist, in a lot of ways very individualist, in some senses charitable, right? The goal was to sort of free, poor enslaved people. And so they weren't the most radical social movements. It's movements of the mass of enslaved people, and it's insurrectionary moments like Nat Turner and others, but also John Brown and Harper's Ferry. These are what really expand and generalize abolitionist sort of ideas. Cool. Do we have any more in the chat?
Another question from the chat. Do you think there are similarities between Johnson and Biden?
Ooh.
Both focus more on uniting a divided nation rather than uplifting the conditions of disenfranchised groups.
Mm-hmm. Johnson and Biden, that's a really interesting question. And I think the answer is that I love it, and I love the sort of temerity with which it's posed. I don't think it's exact, but it's definitely worth reflecting on. In a certain sense, and again, this becomes a little clearer in the next chapter, Johnson by the end is far more of a piece of shit than Biden would like show himself to be. in a sense, Biden, over his trajectory, right, like he comes from being an actual kind of apologist for segregationism, right, like all these things, toward, again, being a more strategic spokesperson of a modernized white supremacy, right, that looks very, very different, right, that engages in, mass incarceration, that engages in, he's a huge supporter of mass incarceration, but that does so in a far more careful way, right? That's not Johnson, whose fully retrograde turn makes him incapable of managing that, in the same way that a Biden would. And so I'm trying to think about like who the Biden would be in this situation, because it's not Lincoln, right? Lincoln is more akin to other figures who have a bit more vision, right? Like a less cowardly Obama or something like that. But Johnson really constitutes this sort of, reversion. And the reversion is, in some ways, honestly, closer to a Trump, but in a certain way, it's not him driving forward or really embracing that position as the leading edge of it, if that makes sense. So he's definitely somewhere in between, but I think it's a provocative question. I can't think exactly of who the Biden would be in this situation, but it would be someone who is a half-hearted abolitionist who only becomes one once it becomes clear that's where everything else is moving, and then himself tries to slow the process down. And there are lots of those figures, I think, in Congress, and there are reasons why Du Bois doesn't talk about them, right? So they swing from one side to the other in ways that are anything but sort of courageous. Cool. I've got Joe.
I'm thinking of the way Du Bois characterizes Andrew Johnson as kind of like the bearer of the characteristics of the poor white. In the beginning of the chapter, he calls him the man who led the way with unconscious paradox and contradiction, right? So this bootlicking proclivity, right, is something that's a kind of a general characteristic of the poor whites. So it seems like a kind of almost like in this Hegelian sense that Andrew Johnson is this figure who there's this culmination of a historical trend in him, but he's representative of kind of a larger, more general spiritual trajectory in some kind of sense. Which what the question I'm trying to get at here is is there a kind of tension though in characterizing Johnson that way, and yet at the same time kind of always pointing to the historical possibility and potential that the poor whites had, right? So it seems like on the one hand, he can't raise himself out of their atavistic kind of inability to see Black people as human. And yet Du Bois wants to hold on to, though, that their inability, that the class of poor whites' inability to step up to the plate at that point in time, it leads us all the way to World War I and beyond. So I don't know. I just wanted to see if you could.
No, it's a great question, on that. And it's an important one because it allows us to think about, and there are ways that Du Bois is positioned in a lot of these questions between a kind of what we could identify in very broad terms as like a liberal position that, I'm trying to think of the best way to approach this, right? And there are many ways in which, so on the question of emancipation and abolition, right? Du Bois is not a liberal who thinks that abolition was everything and the work was completed. Or around the civil rights movement of the 60s, abolition is civil rights is everything, the work is completed, right? Because he's identifying material dynamics that are necessary for those freedoms to be real, right? On the other hand, on the other extreme, you could identify something on this question and also the question of emancipation, something like a slightly Afro-pessimist position that says something along the lines of, on the one hand, emancipation meant nothing, right? And on the other hand, there's no possibility ever of class unity, right? And Du Bois is really trying to thread something in between. And again, because he's looking at what he would understand to be the material and ideological possibilities. And I often say that he didn't write 800 pages because he thought class unity was doomed from the start, right? He wrote it because he sees it as a tragedy. He can see why the tragedy unfolds in the way that it does, and he's trying to alert us to what it would take to prevent that kind of tragedy in the future. And so he's doing multiple things, one of which is to say and to show the sort of proletarian moments in consciousness among poor whites, right? We'll see a lot of this in the different chapters on Reconstruction experiments, because Du Bois will really dig into, he'll begin each chapter from saying what was the actual demographic makeup, right? Poor whites, poor blacks, planters, and that in many ways for him determines the actual political dynamics. But there are states in which poor whites are in the driver's seat. And as a result, what do? They try to obliterate the planters, right? They try to displace them entirely. They try to prevent them from voting, prevent them from holding office, right? And for him, that's a reflection of their proletarian consciousness in a sort of, not a fully developed form, right? A fully developed form he sees emerging in some of the working class movements. He sees it emerging in some things that Marx has written, some positions that other working class organizations have taken where they refuse this division, right? But it doesn't come together, right? It doesn't cohere. And so, I take that to be the question about the contradiction, right? Because he's doing, on the one hand, he's saying Johnson reflects this tendency, and and we see it playing out in him as an individual. But Du Bois is also trying to suggest that that tendency doesn't need to play out in the way that it plays out, right? And that's why it feels so contradictory for him, right? He says, here is someone who loved democracy and hated elites, and he died turning his back on democracy and embracing elites. For Du Bois, that wasn't inevitable, right? But again, permanent tension, permanent contradiction. We can look at events today and say we see exactly this playing out, right? We see exactly, poor white people choosing their race over their class all the time, everywhere, right? Like literally almost everywhere we look around us. And it's more the exception than the rule when that doesn't happen.
Yeah,
Cool.
I'm also trying to keep in mind this book on John Brown.
Yeah,
Right? So,
great book on John Brown. If people haven't read it,
frustrated with the failure of the possibility in this text,
yeah.
mostly. But in John Brown, he's opening up that possibility.
Yeah. And he sees John Brown at the beginning of this book. He says the only person who knew how it would come is John Brown, and he was dead, right? So yeah, but yeah, it's a great question to hold, as we move forward for sure. I'll just move quickly through the next chapter, The Price of Disaster, because this really completes our arc, coming toward the period of radical Reconstruction. And, leaves us in a position where then toward the end of this chapter and the beginning of radical Reconstruction, congressional Republicans are in the driver's seat. Johnson is relatively sidelined as the conclusion of this sort of constitutional crisis. And again, just look quickly at the chapter summary, because this is a bit of a doozy. We saw the phrase, the price of disaster, earlier in the book. I told you to keep your eye on it because it was going to become crucial. And here he says, the price of the disaster of slavery and civil war was the necessity of quickly assimilating into American democracy a mass of ignorant laborers, in whose hands alone for the moment lay the power of preserving the ideals of popular government, of overthrowing a slave economy and establishing upon it an industry primarily for the profit of the workers. It was this price which in the end America refused to pay, and today suffers for that refusal, right? So the price of the disaster of war is the incorporation of particularly formerly enslaved people into democracy. The refusal to pay that, as Du Bois is writing in the 30s, he said, still suffers that refusal, right? 1867 dawns. Capitalists are still uncertain where their interests lay. Recall, they're getting a little wary of the South. They want to defeat the South in the question, in the struggle for predominance over, the federal government. But they're still uncertain where their interests lay. They're willing, as Du Bois says, this is right at the top of the chapter on 325, industry demands profits. Still true today, right? Industry demands profits and is willing to use for this end, Negro freedom or Negro slavery, votes for Negroes, or black codes. Capitalism does not care, right? It will go anyway. But what's happening is that they would love to stabilize their profits in a way that allows for industrial dominance, of the North over the South. And now they confront a president who is fully in the pocket of Southern elites, and attempting now, on top of all of that, to establish an alliance with the West. Now, this gets to Johnson's embrace of radical democracy. If we recall, the West represents a very contradictory sort of element in US kind of ideological history. Settler colonialism, white supremacy, the free soil movement being sort of like, cut right down the middle between white supremacy and actual support for sort of free labor. But despite these contradictions, for Du Bois, there's no possible alliance between the free West, the so-called free West, the settler West, right, and the land monopolies of the Southern elites, right? There's no actual possibility of this alliance, right? But again, Johnson is miscalculating. He's, throwing his rhetorical weight behind the West, and to do so, he begins to attack Northern capitalists. He attacks the banks, he attacks the interest rates, he attacks all of this sort of like, like economic policy that's being driven by capitalists in the Northeast. And as a result, he starts to scare the capitalists off and away from him, right? And away from the alliance he's trying to fuse between the West and the South. Again, as Du Bois puts it very clearly, this is on 327, the abolitionists, at the beginning at least, the abolitionists were not the enemies of capital. Abolitionists were open to capitalist arguments, although they were developing an understanding of the need to transform economic structures and a recognition that even abolition, right, on a very basic level, the abolition of slavery required distribution of land, required what he called brute force if it was going to be kind of upheld and made real. In the meantime, the South was getting more and more intransigent, rejecting the 14th Amendment entirely and insisting on full representation for non-citizens, right? Formerly enslaved non-citizens, by which they meant Black people. Again, this was a power grab. This meant the South would get full apportionment, full seats in Congress for every member of the population, even if they weren't allowing them to be citizens, and certainly much less allowing them to vote. This is when the constitutional crisis really reaches a head. And again, recall, the two positions are state suicide, in which the southern states that rebelled cease to exist, versus these being actually existing states, the more sort of reformist and sort of, accommodationist position. But state suicide, the implication, if you say those states that rebelled are no longer states, this allows for total reorganization, right? It allows for them to become, in this case, military districts, right? Or to be grouped together under broader military districts. And this is where Du Bois gives us really interesting guidance around the question of the Constitution and how we understand it and look to it for guidance. We live in a country that, needless to say, absolutely fetishizes the Constitution, right? Fetishizes a document that was written hundreds of years ago by people that we would not sympathize with or identify with, and who, of course, didn't represent the majority of the population at all. And yet we're told every day that that is the fundamental text. We know it's not the fundamental text because of Reconstruction, right? Because this is the period in which we said, you know what? This text is not enough. We need to add a bunch of amendments to it. To get to those amendments, though, you have to break with the idea that the Constitution is this fetishized thing. And when Du Bois refers to it as a fetish, that's the word fetish comes from the literal, term for something made by human hands, then being elevated above, right? As if it was never made by human hands, right? And being celebrated and worshipped as something more than human when it's actually a human product. He emphasizes the fact that there is no constitutional path out of this, right? You have a situation in which half of the country had left. It's being brought back in. There's no answers in the Constitution that tell you what the path is forward. And as he puts it, the only way forward is what he calls the revolutionary way, which is radical Reconstruction and, by necessity, the Black vote. So again, this is where the real back and forth emerges. The Freedmen's Bureau getting vetoed and then passed over the veto was the first step of this. It leads to a Civil Rights Act, vetoed, passed over the veto. And then as a result of all of this, Congress is like, well, no, now we're actually going to do real Reconstruction, which means you all are going to live under military dictatorship in the US South, right? That's what the Reconstruction Acts begin to drive home, right? This is in many ways the spirit of Sherman. I mean, people know Sherman, you know, who marched through the South during the war, obliterating it, right, on purpose, right, destroying its capacity to produce, and specifically to produce military. This is the federal government returning to that task in a certain sense. Even when it comes to the Reconstruction Acts, right, which reorganized the South into military districts, say you're not states, you're districts now. And again, to be clear, these are not understood along the boundaries of what the states were. They just regroup, recreate a whole new thing that is a military district, put it under the power of generals. Even then, Johnson is trying to do this thing where he's like, okay, now that you've passed Reconstruction over my veto, I'm just going to sack these generals and replace them with other generals. So then Congress passes a law called the tenure of office, which still, again, this is coming up today with Trump, right? When he's trying to sort of fire federal employees for no given reason, it comes up against the tenure of office law, which is passed during this period because of this, right? Because he's trying to get around Reconstruction by naming a general that won't be as radical to govern these military districts. So you've got the Tenure of Office Act, then he's sort of imposed, and then Johnson violates it by trying to replace generals, and that's why he's ultimately impeached, although he survives impeachment by one vote. At every step, Johnson is getting more and more intransigent, right? He is becoming more and more white supremacist. He's speaking openly, and Du Bois documents this, of the accomplishments of white civilization. He's, all the things that he never said previously are coming through more directly. He's becoming, but he's also, he's becoming more and more open to pardoning Confederates, including sort of Confederate generals. He's sending cannons, like literally sending federal cannons to disloyal generals in parts of the South. It's just wild, wild shit is happening during this period. And then openly embracing what Du Bois calls race hate. And all of this is driving Reconstruction to be more radical, which is why I talk about the whip of the counter-revolution, right? It is this intransigent counter-revolution, this intransigent right-wing reactionary white supremacist Confederate sort of interest that is pushing Johnson as its vehicle, making him unable to see a sort of more moderate path forward. All of that is what gives us the gift of a far more radical, process of Reconstruction. And it speaks to a mutual polarization, which is beneficial, right? Polarization is not always a bad thing, which is something to keep in mind today. When things are polarizing, it also creates the possibility of something far more radical on our side. The breaking point of this standoff was, again, what he calls a massive step toward democracy. The price, and again, he repeats it, the price of that disaster of slavery and war, a portentous, what he calls a portentous forward step in democracy. And it was the only price adequate to that fatal mistake, meaning white supremacy, meaning slavery, and the refusal to sort of move backward on it. And this is where Du Bois speaks of dictatorship, right? This is where he raises the question of what it means to live under a dictatorship. And for him, dictatorship means transition. That's really important to understand. And he speaks, so this is over on page 345. It's a really incredible page that's worth you all digging into whenever you can. To a few far-seeing leaders of democracy, this experiment appeared in its truer light. It was a test of the whole theory of American government. It was a dictatorship backed by the military arm of the United States, by which the governments of the southern states were to be coerced into accepting a new form of administration, in which the freedmen and the poor whites were to hold the overwhelming balance of political power. As soon as political power was successfully delivered into the hands of these elements, the federal government was to withdraw and full democracy ensue. Dictatorship means transition. But the difficulty is precisely this as well. It's a question of time. The difficulty with this theory was the failure to realize that such a dictatorship must last long enough really to put the mass of workers in power. That this would be, in fact, a dictatorship of the proletariat, which must endure until the proletariat, or at least a leading united group with clear objects and effective method, had education and experience and had taken firm control of the economic organization of the South. That did not happen. Reconstruction was a dictatorship, but it didn't last long enough. Dictatorship, the dictatorship of the proletariat, this is very classic sort of framing from Marx down to Lenin, means precisely the question of the moment of transition between capitalism and communism. You don't go straight from one to the other. Something has to happen in between. A period has to exist in between in which your enemies are defeated, in which society is reorganized, and in which people are educated and develop the kind of consciousness needed to lead a new society, right? This is the same exact process of dictatorship that Du Bois is pointing toward. You have to maintain it long enough to defeat the enemies of Reconstruction, to reorganize the economy of the South, and for formerly enslaved people, and this had already come up in the debates around abolition, for formerly enslaved people to be developing a conscious orientation and level of political education that will allow for this process to consolidate and stabilize, right? It didn't last long enough for Du Bois, right? It lasted until 1876. In 1876, this is the sort of rough arc that folks probably already know, there's a contested election in which a Republican, meaning a sort of more progressive pro-Reconstruction party, a Republican is put into power on the promise that he withdraw the troops from the South. The Compromise of 1876 is the agreement that, okay, you give the presidency to a Republican and the troops will be withdrawn. That's what happens on the surface. That's the end of Reconstruction in 1876. What's happening below the surface, of course, for Du Bois is that capitalism is fed up with the experiment, right? Capitalism wanted to use black votes to break the white South and its leadership. As soon as that was accomplished, capitalism was happy with the outcome. And more than that, and we'll see this on, particularly in the next chapter on South Carolina, the inevitable progression for Du Bois is that you don't simply give formerly enslaved poor people the vote in the majority in South Carolina and expect them not to vote for economic equality and expect them not to build something along more egalitarian lines. There's an inevitable slide for Du Bois from political rights to economic rights, and that was one thing that capitalism did not want to be supporting. So capital withdraws its support in 1876. The troops are withdrawn from the South. That's the end of Reconstruction. Why it's the end is something that we'll talk about more, but it has everything to do with the brute force that Du Bois says that's required to uphold equality. So capitalists were pushed into the arms of abolition democracy, sort of against their will. They embraced black freedom and they embraced the vote, if it meant breaking the back of the Southern plantocracy. But these were truly the strangest of bedfellows for Du Bois. If you look at the middle of 346, it's an incredibly powerful paragraph describing this moment, again, the overlapping of interests for this brief period of 7 to 10 years. Thus, by singular coincidence and for a moment, for the few years of an eternal second in a cycle of 1,000 years, the orbits of two widely and utterly dissimilar economic systems coincided, and the result was a revolution so vast and portentous that few minds ever fully conceived it. For the systems were these: abolition democracy on the one hand, tending toward a dictatorship of the proletariat, and capitalist autocracy and power on the other, right? Dramatically opposed interests overlapped for an eternal second in a cycle of 1,000 years. For a second, for a pulse of time, these orbits crossed and coincided, but their central suns were 1,000 light years apart, even though the blind and ignorant fury of the South and the complacent Philistinism of the North saw them as one. Inevitably, they diverged, right? And this gets to Joe's point as well, right? Wasn't a lot of this inevitable? Wasn't it inevitable that capitalism would withdraw its support? Yes, right? And these are some of the questions we need to raise about what other alternative possibilities existed. Inevitably, they diverged when their interests separated, aided by very different understandings as well of freedom, which he lays out on 347. All these contending and antagonistic groups spoke different and unknown tongues. To the Negro, freedom was God. We talked about that in the coming of the Lord. This is very interesting, though. To the poor white, freedom was nothing. He had more than he had use for. It's a very cryptic little phrase, but it speaks to what he laid out from the very beginning in the way that poor whites in the South were outside of the economy, right? They were fully free, right? Which meant that they had nothing, right? They had no jobs, they had no support. So freedom meant nothing to them. To the planter, freedom for the poor was laziness, and for the rich, control of the poor worker. For the northern businessman, freedom was the opportunity to get rich. When white workers were convinced that the degradation of Negro labor was more fundamental than the uplift of white labor, the end was in sight. And this gets back to this question of the tragedy of the, not even the collapse, but the failure of this sort of class solidarity to ever cohere in this moment. The fact that the dictatorship of Reconstruction didn't last long enough for it to develop foundations, and the fact that those foundations will be poured in opposition to all of these tendencies that were pushing back against it simultaneously. And this isn't just a tragedy. This is where Du Bois ends the chapter. It isn't just a tragedy for Black labor, right? It isn't just a tragedy for Reconstruction. It isn't just a tragedy for people who had been emancipated only to be forced back toward slavery, in his words, although it certainly was for them as well. But on the top of 358, Du Bois emphasizes the fact that poor whites and white workers even didn't recognize what he described as, as he puts it, there was being put into force one of the most extraordinary experiments in Marxism that the world before the Russian Revolution had seen, right? Again, part of the American blind spot is precisely that workers in the North were looking across at the Paris Commune in 1871 and not looking south to South Carolina. They were unable to understand Black people as workers, their action as a general strike, and what they were building as a commune. But all of these things were happening for Du Bois in what he calls one of the most extraordinary experiments in Marxism that the world had ever seen. And so the tragedy is also fundamentally a tragedy for poor whites and for white labor. Because in Du Bois's framing, the white working class had fully disarmed itself in its attacks on Reconstruction, in its unwillingness and inability to see these overlapping interests. And as a result, when the counterattack comes from capital, right? Because we're reading this story heavily and primarily through capital withdrawing and the counterattack of poor whites and planters against recently enfranchised Black Southerners, right? For Du Bois, of course, these contending visions, abolition democracy and capitalist autocracy, are still there. And the counterattack is also a capitalist counterattack on workers, right? And so he says, this is toward the bottom of 367, thus labor went into the Great War of 1877 against Northern capitalists, unsupported by the Black man. And the Black man went his way in the South to strengthen and consolidate his power, unsupported by Northern labor. Suppose for a moment that Northern labor had stopped the bargain of 1876 and maintained the power of the labor vote in the South. And suppose that the Negro, with new and dawning consciousness of the demands of labor as differentiated from the demands of capitalists, meaning cutting against the American assumption, had used his vote more specifically for the benefit of white labor, South and North. This was the tragedy of the breakdown of that. And not even, again, breakdown, the failed consolidation, missed opportunity that this posed. Again, not simply a tragedy for Black labor, although we'll see very dramatically so. Also a tragedy for white workers who disarmed themselves right before the capitalist counterattack really landed in 1877. All of this leads us up to Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction. I mean, he sort of told us the arc of it and the conclusion of it, but what he goes into next are the state-by-state analyses of what happens under the Reconstruction governments. the most, in some ways, the most important, certainly the most radical, is South Carolina. And that's what we're going to read for next week. The South Carolina, it's been referred to as the South Carolina Commune. Du Bois notes, if you pay attention to the very first page of the chapter, has an incredibly powerful footnote where he says that he almost called this chapter the dictatorship of the Black proletariat in South Carolina. South Carolina is crucial. We're going to read that alone, and then we're going to go into kind of hyperspeed the week after that, moving through all of the other sort of state-by-state chapters to try to glean what important differences existed in these different states. But remember that South Carolina represents the radical pole, the most radical possibility of Reconstruction. And so the questions that we approach it with are questions about who benefited in South Carolina, who was Reconstruction for, how was it upheld, how was it defeated, right? These are the fundamental questions for the entire process, but South Carolina is sort of the focus of the most radical pole of this process. Cool. So we can take a few questions on this arc that leads us right into the most radical experiments with Reconstruction before we wrap up. We've got maybe 10 minutes for questions. We got some in the chat? Cool.
First question: are dictatorships required to meaningfully reorganize societies, or are transitions of societies, economies, reconciliation possible without authoritarian regimes?
Are dictatorships required, or is transition possible without authoritarian regimes? It's an incredibly important question. And it gets us, it doesn't bring us necessarily back to the sort of question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but we can see in that question, some of the really important structural pieces to this. Which is to say, I'll say two different things, right? One is about the dictatorship of the proletariat. That dictatorship does not need to be exercised through the state as we understand it. And if anything, it can't be ever exercised through the state as we understand it. If you read Lenin in State and Revolution, which is Lenin's most important text on these questions, but it's also the text where he shares the most with a certain kind of anarchist vision of the dissolution of the state, right? This is where Lenin is saying, as soon as the worker sees the state has to become something different, right? He's not only arguing against the anarchists who don't want there to be a dictatorship at all, but he's also arguing against what he calls the opportunists who want to use the state as is. Lenin says you cannot use the state as is. That's why you're talking about different forms of power. And that's the sort of bifurcation I think is really crucial to start to think about then the second piece, which is the concrete question of what would have been necessary for Reconstruction to have happened and to have survived. I think we'll talk a lot more about this, but again, Du Bois, he's working through this, right? Again, early Du Bois emphasizes education and uplift, right? Led particularly by, elites. He moves radically away from that. He embraces economic transformation. He says, you know what? Political participation and education are not enough. We need land, light, and leading, meaning economic, political, and sort of economic, educational, and political power. All three, right, Du Bois says. And he adds to that in this context, brute force. Why? In practice, Reconstruction was a dictatorship because the South would not allow it to happen otherwise, right? The South had to be broken. The power of that Southern leading class had to be broken. Someone had to break it. It is not necessary that the force that had to do that in any circumstance was the Union Army of the federal government of the North, right? It could have been broken by other force. But for Du Bois, the key piece is that it has to be a brute force. It has to be a force that's able to not only break the power of your enemies, but also then uphold, in this case, the Black vote in the South. Because what happens with the defeat of Reconstruction? Black people in the South still have the right to vote on paper, right? But the right to vote doesn't mean anything if you're being chased away from the polls by mobs of Klan members, right? Brute force is the question, right? So to answer the question, are dictatorships required? Yes, if we understand dictatorship as a forceful transition. No, if we understand it to be solely about the state as we understand it. It always automatically moves beyond that state and seeks to radically dismantle that state ultimately. And in this case, what that could look like on a very fundamental level is the force that, say, the Klan targeted first, right? Which was armed Black militias, right? one of the fundamental strategies of the Black codes and of the Klan was to disarm Black communities, right? Because they knew that those communities could also be a force that could counter their power, right? And so if we want to imagine, say, a process of Reconstruction, and certainly a process of Reconstruction that can survive after 1876, right? That can survive the withdrawal of the Northern troops, it has to be grounded in that question of a kind of decentralized, armed, self-defense movements, right? Which is a long trajectory, right? Armed self-defense has an entire trajectory from that right up to the present, particularly in the Black South as well. So that's a good question, though. Do we have any questions in the room? Y'all gonna let the chat run everything? Do we have more in the chat? Oh, cool. Sure.
They followed up with, specifically, they're thinking about how South Africa had truth and reconciliation, but largely material conditions were still uneven, and also trying to think about what is required to reorganize Palestine.
Yeah.
And chat supremacy is what is being said right now.
Chat supremacy. Oh my God. The bravery. Keyboard warriors, right? And the question of Palestine. Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? South Africa is a great example of more truth and reconciliation than the US South ever had, right? But still something which fell dramatically short of what was necessary. Material conditions didn't change. Power in the military in South Africa didn't change. Truth and reconciliation is always a funny framing, right? Because it's this very important and crucial and very partial step, right? Because it's like, what are you reconciling? On what basis, right? Are you reconciling? And yeah, no. So there's lots of different pieces that come in here, but I'm thinking about this, these sort of like things that are being shared today, saying, well, it's really funny that people are saying, where's Palestine's Mandela, right? This is like the language of the liberals and the right, because Nelson Mandela helped to organize an armed revolutionary movement that helped to put into motion, right, the actual liberation of South Africa, right? And that trajectory is a very tried and true one, right? Without that armed struggle, there would have been no truth and reconciliation in South Africa. And if anything, here's the sort of, I was gonna say spicy, it's really not spicy at this point. The ANC, when it comes to power, disarms these movements, right? That's a key mistake, right? It disarms not only armed revolutionary movements, but it also disarms grassroots movements of democracy like street committees and neighborhood committees that are providing an alternative decentralized state structure or alternative to the state, right, on the community level. And again, this happens over and over again. It happens in the Haitian Revolution, it happened in South Africa, the ways in which movements come to power and then cut themselves off at the knees, right? They attack their own left wing, they attack their own most sort of fervent and loyal supporters, and as a result, they weaken themselves and they lead to their own downfall, right? And it's a sort of dynamic that repeats. What does all of this mean for Reconstruction in Palestine? I mean, it's an incredibly important question. I feel like we may have talked about it a little bit before. I wrote a short piece called Black Reconstruction in Palestine. People came at me a little bit because Du Bois had this very early flirtation with Zionism, where he's sort of, like many other Black American leaders, embracing Zionism as a model for sort of Black solidarity. And that's true. And he has some writings, particularly in the late 30s into the 40s, I believe, that are, not things that we would support or that he himself later would support, but he actually turns away from Zionism far earlier than many sort of Black leaders. Because, and Robin Kelly has documented really well the way that support for Israel in the civil rights movement is a very class-based thing, right? It's a sort of more middle-class elements of the civil rights movement remain and retain their solidarity with Israel, whereas the more radical elements and the more working class elements are very quick to see in the treatment of Arabs themselves, right? And so you have, particularly in 1967 with the 67 war, an explosion of Black Palestinian solidarity. First huge wave of it, right? And it's a break with this sort of traditional position. Anyway, the question of Reconstruction, though, and it's something that I would encourage you all to think about when you're reading through South Carolina, right? It poses really important lessons, I think, and challenges for what liberation and decolonization of Palestine would look like, right? On the one hand, you've got this sort of paranoid fear of the idea of, from the river to the sea is a sort of genocidal, eliminationist statement and phrase and aspiration. We know that that's not what it means, right? We know that the abolition and dismantling of the state of Israel doesn't mean the elimination of any sort of community from that territory necessarily. It does mean, however, the radical liberation, and we should be super clear about this, it means the liberation of Jews from the yoke of having to uphold and represent an ethno-state, right? That's the key, a key piece of the liberation is the way in which Reconstruction poses and frames the possibility of a liberation for everyone involved in the building and establishment of a truly sort of democratic and egalitarian state. Now, in Palestine, that's going to be incredibly complicated because it also means, as Du Bois emphasizes, redistribution, right? It means people get their land back. It means people have to give up homes that they, think are their own, but were literally stolen from people 75 years ago, right? And so that's not going to be any kind of easy process, but it's also an inevitable one, right? And I think we know the inevitability of that decolonization and that liberation. Again, that's why some people aren't with us today, is because they're out at a march confirming that inevitability as we move forward. But yeah, it's a great question. Well, we have a challenger to the chat supremacy.
My question is, if we're saying that we need to sustain the movement after the brute force or after the armed struggle, and this is looking forward, we're thinking about the reason that Black Reconstruction didn't, or that period didn't succeed, how do we sustain it when the material conditions are influenced by the force that we're trying to change? So, like, for example, how do we create material conditions of, like, smaller communities when we're self-sufficient, when all of our food has to come from the grocery store, that has to come from like big farms, and how do we, when we have to go to work and we have to pay rent and we have to have all of just like the day-to-day things that we need, that's fully controlled by the system that we're trying to work out of. How do we even do that?
That's a great question. This question of sustaining on a material level, particularly again, I take this also to mean that capitalism is really pulling the strings here, right? In this, allowing Reconstruction to proceed for 10 years and then pulling the rug out from under it. And that's absolutely true. And that's the consolidation of the kind of capitalist domination that Du Bois would understand us to be completely living under now, right? And here I think, it's not like an easy answer of any kind, but here I think it's incredibly important to pay close attention to the piece that I was mentioning that Du Bois, it's not even a criticism, but that isn't part of the story, which is what happens outside of the state and what happens outside of the circuits of capital, right? And that's something that's always been present, right? And there's this tendency to sort of downplay, and this is a tendency across many different approaches, to downplay what we call generally reproductive labor, which is often understood to be gendered and domestic labor, but the category of reproductive labor is much, much bigger, right? It's everything the community needs to survive, right? Within capitalism, reproductive labor is everything the worker needs to eat, sleep, survive, wake up the next day and be able to produce for capital, right? But we're also kind of like trying to think about what that means when you break it out of capital, right? What does that look like under slavery? It looks like what Angela Davis documents as the work of primarily women, but not necessarily, those who are building community alongside the slave system, right? Those who are growing, crops, those who are sustaining, community structure and fabric, right? Those who are creating the basis for what then becomes resistance to the slave system. Whenever you see direct, what you call dialectical, confrontational, oppositional resistance to a system, think about what's happening in the background to sustain that resistance, right? And the other work that's being done to make it happen. And all of that is to say that once in the aftermath of emancipation, it becomes more important, because the question is, and it becomes very, very clear, right? This happens in Haiti as well. People are fighting not for emancipation from slavery, strictly speaking, but people are fighting for the dismantling of the plantation structure, right? And so when you free people in Haiti or in the US South, and then say, well, but we still need a lot of these, we still need this cotton to export for money, so go back to work under the same conditions on the same, plantation, people fight that and resist it. And you begin to see in the actions of resistance that people take a desire to build a different kind of economic structure, right? Ultimately, in Haiti, this disintegrates even the post-revolutionary government because people just refuse. They pull back and they begin to grow their own crops and all these things. In Du Bois, you see it in, the again, experiments with socialized agriculture, right? People taking over communal agriculture, growing together, building communities together, and they're not, very interesting, right? Not growing cotton, right? Because you can't eat cotton, right? You can't survive off of cotton. Cotton is valuable for the global capitalist market, not so valuable, for, local communities. So for me, it really opens up that question of what kind of alternatives are being built. And that's a strategic question. It's a sustainability question. When we reach forward into the 60s and 70s, where, you've got the expulsion and exclusion of many Black workers from the capitalist economy, where you've got the abandonment of sort of urban centers. You have someone like George Jackson saying, what do? We don't abandon the cities and move to the country and start growing crops. He says we build communes in the cities themselves. And we begin to develop those communes out and connect them to rural communes and build a kind of communal infrastructure. And that's what sustains that struggle, right? Again, not easy whatsoever, but. Okay.
And they're big questions, but I think they're good.
Okay, we can maybe take them both, and then I'll just wrap it. Yeah.
So last two questions from the chat. The first one, so what does Reconstruction in America look like in the present day, especially armed struggle?
Yeah.
What are the preliminary steps? And then the second question is related to the question about sustainability. What are the examples or lessons from our anti-imperialist siblings in the global South, be it in waging or defending their revolution or even in developing sovereignty?
Around sustainability or just in
Related,
general?
I think, to the previous question.
Lessons from the global South, for sure. This is a great question. They're really, they are very much tied together, especially if we're thinking about the present. The fundamental starting point is the fact that Reconstruction was never finished. We live in a context that demands a new Reconstruction. People have spoken of second and third Reconstructions, right? In an attempt to, on the one hand, again, obliterate and dismantle the power of the neo-Confederacy, right, which is still very much a power, which we see, surfacing, in the present, and to understand that that is an economic struggle, right? The shortest version of this is that people were freed from slavery and the economic structure didn't change at all. Meaning that even if they weren't specially targeted for racial oppression, they still had to sell their labor on a market that was based on plantation agriculture, and the same kinds of conditions, right? On top of that, of course, you have Black codes that targeted people directly, that sought to impose a new form of slavery, in vagrancy laws, in apprenticeship laws, in convict leasing. All of that leads over the course of time to prisons, police, and mass incarceration as the new institutions that do that work of, on the one hand, guaranteeing cheap labor, and on the other hand, controlling sort of dangerous and fear-inducing populations, specifically Black Americans, right? So it does racial work and does economic work. These institutions have, of course, run right up to the present, which is why people talk about abolition and why we fundamentally at the Abolition School talk about Reconstruction, right? Because we note and emphasize the fact that you can't simply tear down institutions without rebuilding something different, right? Reconstruction means that if we got rid of the police tomorrow, but if we don't change the structure of the city, there's going to be more police the next day, whether it's private security guards, vigilantes, right? They're all going to come out of the woodwork because we haven't changed the structure of society, right? And so for me, it's not so much a question of armed struggle as it is definitely a question of community self-defense, right? Because what would a self-sustaining community without police look like today? It would have to be able to defend itself, especially in a context of white supremacist aggression, right? But when you defend your community from the police, for example, with, community sort of networks of rapid response, and sort of cop watching and making sure the police aren't intervening in your neighborhood, you're also providing a foundation for the kind of community that wouldn't need police at all, right? Because if someone is disrupting, the block, or if a young person is doing something sort of like harmful that could be redirected, or if there's sort of domestic violence on the block, that's also a structure that can intervene to provide that community safety, right? So the question of Reconstruction is definitely and fundamentally a question of rebuilding community in that way. And that's why we also often talk about community as the antidote to police, the antidote to prisons. Not any community, of course, but sort of poor and working class communities of color in particular. And this connects directly to the question of the lessons of the Global South. And for me, it's a very important sort of autobiographical one, because I was sort of living in Venezuela and studying self-defense sort of militias, and that ended up being the most radical wing of the Chavista revolution down there. And these are communities that had kicked the police out decades ago, right, and governed themselves through self-defense. And I would go back and forth between there and where I was living at the time, which was Oakland, California, where the Black Panther Party is from, right? And I started to realize that not only are these communities fighting against the same systems, they're also fighting for the same thing, right? So some of those lessons are in the very clear reality of the possibility of a kind of abolitionist self-defense, right? We think of these things as impossible, but there are many examples. Again, Venezuela, you've got many communities in southern Mexico in particular, some indigenous communities, some non-indigenous communities that have established self-defense networks, established so-called community police, although they're not really police, they're just community members, that have taken over and built different kinds of structures. And one of the arguments we would always get, and when I say we, I mean like organizers, whether it's here in Philly or when I was living in Oakland, was that vulnerable communities can't afford to engage in this, right? Or vulnerable communities can't take these kinds of risks. But the reality that these arguments always sort of raised was the fact that vulnerable communities are the ones that are suffering, right, with the status quo, right? And when you look internationally, it's definitely moments of the most heightened vulnerability in civil war, in Ireland, Northern Ireland, in South Africa, right, during the armed struggle, in Latin America, amid the sort of devastation of the drug war, right? That's where communities are sort of daring, just to take control entirely and say, we just sort of essentially cut the cord and say, we are not going to continue to try to negotiate with the system. We're going to build something very different. So I think those are really great questions to wrap it up with. Thank you all so much. Thanks to everyone on the stream, and thanks to everyone in the room. And we will be talking about South Carolina next week. So please check it out.